The sound of Mara Whitcomb's palm striking Cade Larkin's face snapped across the iron gate yard. Not loud enough to scare the horses, loud enough to silence every man who'd been pretending not to watch. Cade was built like a barn door, with shoulders made by cattle work and a temper made by whiskey. Mara stood in front of him, with flour still on her sleeve, one hand at her side, the other still lifted from the blow. On the porch of the main house, Caleb Rourke watched without moving. So did his daughter. Did the men who had eaten Mara's bread every morning and laughed at her name every evening until they learned better. In Cinder Wash, a poor woman did not strike a drover. She did not shame a storekeeper's hired muscle in public. She did not stand between a rich man's accusation and a child who had already lost too much. But Mara had not come to Iron Gate because she was proper. She had come because hunger had narrowed her life to one road, and that road led straight into a ranch full of men who thought a woman alone was something to be managed. 3 months earlier, that road began in a cabin with a roof that leaked through 3 different corners, and a brother who slammed a creditor's notice onto the table so hard the tin cups jumped. "You're taking the post," Silas said. Mara did not look up from the pan. There was 1 onion left, half a scoop of meal, and coffee so thin it looked like something that had only heard about coffee from a distance. "No." Silas laughed once, without humor. "No is for people with options." She turned then. Her younger brother was 22, but grief and liquor had carved 10 extra years into him. Their father had died after a bad fall in the north pasture. Their mother had lasted 1 winter after that, as if she'd been waiting for permission to stop fighting. What remained of the Whitcomb place was 27 acres of exhausted dirt, 2 milk goats, a leaning shed, and debt nailed to the door like a curse. Silas shoved the notice closer. "The bank gives us until the 1st of the month." Mara read the number, though she already knew it. It was more money than she could earn mending shirts, more than Silas could earn hauling fence posts when he bothered to show up sober, and more than the land could make in a year. "There's cookwork at Iron Gate," he said. "Room, board, month." She stared at him. "At Caleb Rourke's place?" "The biggest cattle outfit between here and the Black Mesa. They pay on time." "They also run through cooks like fire through paper." "That means they need one bad enough not to ask too many questions." Mara set the pan down. "And you think I should go live 20 miles from town, cook for strangers, and send every cent back here while I fix what I can," Silas snapped. The room went quiet. That was the trouble with family. Even when they failed you, they still knew exactly where to press. Mara looked around the cabin. Her mother's blue shawl hung on a peg beside the stove. Mother's bootjack was still under the chair. The house was poor, but it held the shape of everyone she had loved. "How long?" she asked. Silas swallowed. 6-month agreement. Trial week first. 6 months sounded like exile. It also sounded like time enough to save the only home they had left. Mara wiped her hands on her apron. "The wages go to the bank before they go anywhere else. Not the saloon, not cards, not your friends." "I know." "No, Silas, you hear me. If I leave and you drink away what I earn, don't look for me to come back and forgive you." His face shifted. hurt and shame fighting for space. I said I know. Mara wanted to believe him. Wanting was easy. The next morning, Cinderwash watched her pack. Women who had accepted her help during childbirth looked through her like she carried sickness. Men who owed her father kindness stared at the street. Mrs. Elspeth Bell, who ran the boarding rooms and had arranged the post, pressed a paper into Mara's hand. "Give that to Caleb Rourke," she said. "He asked for someone steady." "He asked for a cook." "He asked for both. He just does not know it yet." The supply wagon left after sunrise. By the time the town disappeared behind a roll of scrubland, Mara had stopped looking back. Irongate Ranch did not appear all at once. The smell of cattle, then the dust cloud above the lower pens, then a string of fencing that looked too straight and too sturdy to belong to any poor man. Finally, the ranch opened below the ridge, a wide valley full of corrals, sheds, barns, bunkhouse roofs, and a two-story timber house set slightly above the rest, like it had been ordered to keep watch. The driver, old Penn, spat over the wheel. "Rourke built that after his wife died." Mara glanced at him. "The house?" "The whole thing, near enough. Some men grieve by drinking, some by praying. Caleb Rourke built fences until the valley ran out of corners." At the bunkhouse, men turned to stare before the wagon even stopped, whistled low. Mara ignored it. A boyish cowhand in a flat-brimmed hat leaned against a post. "You the new cook?" "I am." "You look cleaner than the last one." "I intend to stay that way as long as possible." The boy grinned, but a hard voice cut across the yard. "Benton, get back to the West Pen before I find a worse job for you." The speaker was Wyatt Bell, the foreman. Tall, sun-browned, and narrow-eyed, he looked like a man who had been born disappointed and practiced the expression daily. "Mara Whitcomb?" he asked. She handed him Mrs. Bell's paper. He read it, then looked her over with no attempt at politeness. "Mr." The walk to the main house felt longer than the road from town. Caleb Rourke's office smelled of paper, leather, and old smoke. He stood beside a desk covered in ledgers, a tall man in his mid-30s, with dark hair touched by gray at the temples, and eyes that made excuses die before they reached the tongue. "You have cooked for a crew before?" he asked. "My mother took in boarders. My father hired extra hands for planting before the land went bad. I have cooked for hungry men." "How many?" 14 on the worst week. "I have 22 right now, more during drive season." "Then I will cook more." His mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Mrs. Bell says you are reliable." "Mrs. Bell says many things." "Are they true?" "Usually." Caleb stepped closer to the window and looked down toward the yard. 1 week trial. Breakfast at 5:30. Dinner for the midday crew. Supper at 6:30. You keep the bunkhouse kitchen clean. You manage supplies through Wyatt. You help Mrs. Elena Marquez at the house when she asks. My daughter June eats here most evenings." Mara kept her face still. A widower, then. A ranch with a child at the top of it always had a wound somewhere. Caleb turned back. "Any man bothers you, you tell Wyatt or me." "And if he bothers me faster than I can find either of you?" This time he did smile, but it was small. Then I expect he will learn something. Good. His eyes sharpened with interest. You have a sharp tongue, Miss Whitcomb. I try to keep it cleaner than the knives. Wyatt coughed like he was hiding a laugh. Caleb signed the agreement and slid it across the desk. Then prove you can cook. The bunkhouse kitchen looked like a place where food went to die. Grease glazed the stove. Dried beans clung to the floorboards. The prep table was sticky enough to trap a fly. A bucket near the door held something that had once been dishwater and had since become a legal argument. Mara stood in the middle of it with her bag in her hand. Wyatt waited for her to complain. She did not. Instead, she set down her mother's recipe book, rolled up her sleeves, and said, I need lye soap, boiling water, sand, 2 scrub brushes, and any man on this ranch who has sinned badly enough to need penance. By midnight, the kitchen no longer looked diseased. By 5 the next morning, Mara woke to a knock in a woman's voice. You are late only if you panic. Mara opened the door to find Elena Marquez, the housekeeper, standing in the kitchen with a lantern in one hand and coffee already started on the stove. Elena was past 60, small and straight-backed, with silver-black hair pinned tight at her neck, and the kind of eyes that could measure flour, grief, and foolishness in the same glance. I thought I had time, Mara said, rushing for her apron. You scrubbed until after midnight. Time was always going to cheat you. Come, bacon first, batter second. Shame never fed a man. They worked without ceremony. By 5:30, flapjacks hit tin plates, bacon crackled, coffee poured, and 22 cowhands came through the door smelling of dust, sleep, and expectation. At first they watched Mara more than they watched the food. Then they tasted the food. The room changed. A man named Amos muttered, Well, I'll be damned. Another said, This has salt in it on purpose. By the end of the meal, nobody had laughed. By the end of the week, they were asking whether she could make biscuits. By the end of the month, they were chopping stove wood without being ordered and leaving eggs near the kitchen door, as if feeding the cook were a kind of worship. Mara did not mistake respect for kindness, but she accepted it anyway. On her 8th day, Caleb called her to the house. She expected dismissal. She had burned 1 pan of beans, broken a crock, and told a cowhand that if he called her little lady again, he could eat little rocks. Instead, Caleb opened the ledger and wrote her name in ink. You passed. Mara stared at the page. Just like that? Not just like that. That. You cleaned a kitchen 3 men were afraid to enter. You fed the crew on time. Nobody has threatened to quit over breakfast. That puts you ahead of the last 4 cooks. I set the smoke alarm off with the beans. We do not have a smoke alarm. Then I set off whatever men call it when they all run outdoors coughing. That earned the smile again. A small girl appeared in the office doorway. She was 8 or near it, thin as a candle and serious as a church bell. Her black hair fell in 2 uneven braids, and she held a book against her chest like a shield. Caleb's voice changed when he saw her. It softened before he could stop it. June, this is Miss Whitcomb. The girl looked at Mara's apron. Mrs. Marquez says you make biscuits that split like clouds. I have never eaten a cloud, so I cannot confirm. June considered that. "Could you teach me?" Caleb's shoulders tightened. Mara saw it and understood. Children made adults fearful because children attached themselves to anything warm. "If your father allows it," Mara said, "I can teach you Saturday afternoon." June looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Mara. The office held a silence full of things no one had said. Finally, he nodded. "One lesson." June smiled. The smile made the room less haunted. Saturday lessons became the only quiet thing in Mara's week. She taught June biscuits first, then soda bread, then apple hand pies. June was careful with flour and too forceful with eggs. She asked questions that came from places adults tried not to touch. "Do mothers teach daughters everything?" "No," Mara said. "Only what they have time for." "Did yours teach you a lot?" "Enough to keep me from starving, not enough to keep me from missing her." June looked at the dough. "I do not remember mine." Mara laid a hand beside the rolling pin, not on the child, not yet. "Then you get to learn her in pieces, from people who did remember. Papa does not talk about her." "Maybe talking makes him bleed." June nodded like that made sense. From the doorway, Caleb watched without entering. Mara saw him, but she pretended not to. That was the beginning of trouble. Not because anything improper happened. Because in towns like Cinder Wash, a poor woman did not need to sin to be punished. She only needed to be noticed. Adeline Price arrived in September wearing gloves too white for a ranch and a smile too sharp for company. Her father owned Price Mercantile, which meant he owned half the credit and most of the gossip in Cinder Wash. Adeline had decided Caleb Rourke would be a fine husband, and everyone in town had decided the matter sounded reasonable. He had land. She had standing. He had a motherless child. She had opinions about how a motherless child should be managed. She brought sugared cakes wrapped in paper and offered them as if Iron Gate had been starving for refinement. Elena took one look at the cakes and whispered to Mara, "Try." Mara pressed her lips together to hide a smile. At supper that evening, Caleb asked Mara to prepare a meal for the house. "Something decent," Wyatt said when he carried the message. Mara looked at the pot of stew already feeding 22 men. "Tell Mr. he may have decent or impossible, but not both in half an hour." Elena heard and laughed for the first time since Mara had arrived. They managed roasted chicken with sage, potatoes crisped in bacon fat, green beans with onion, and a small pear tart saved from fruit almost too bruised to use. Adeline took one bite and said, "How rustic." June stopped chewing. Elena's face went still. Caleb set down his fork. Adeline did not notice. She was too busy arranging her own importance. Of course, once June is at school in Santa Fe, the household can be brought into proper order. A ranch is no place for a girl to grow up wild among hired men. June looked at Caleb as if someone had opened the floor beneath her chair. Caleb's voice was quiet. "June is not being sent away." Adeline laughed lightly. "Not forever, of course. But if you mean to remarry, you must think of appearances." "I am thinking of my daughter." The room cooled. By the time Adeline left, her father's buggy tracks cut deep through the dust, and her smile had vanished. By morning, Cinder Wash had a new story. Mara Whitcomb, the desperate cook, had bewitched Caleb Rourke. She had done it with biscuits, with the child, with sympathy, with whatever ugly invention the teller preferred. Adeline had been insulted. Caleb had been compromised. Irongate had become indecent. The gossip reached the ranch in pieces. A driver mentioned it while unloading flour. A hired hand from a neighboring outfit snickered over his plate. 2 new drovers went quiet whenever Mara entered the room. She ignored it until ignoring became its own kind of lie. One afternoon she heard a man say, "A woman does not spend that much time with a man's child unless she is aiming for the man." Mara set a pot of beans on the table hard enough to make broth jump. The room went silent. The speaker was Jory Pike, new to Irongate, and old enough to know better. "Say it again," Mara said. Jory shifted. "I did not mean—" "You meant every word. You just thought I would be small enough not to answer." A few men looked down at their plates. Mara's voice stayed even. "I cook here. I work here. I teach that girl because she asked to learn, and because someone should teach her that a kitchen can be more than a place where women disappear. If you think kindness is a scheme, that says more about your heart than mine." Jory flushed. Wyatt appeared by the door. "Pike, pack your bedroll." Jory stared. "For words?" "For stupidity loud enough to poison supper." Caleb heard by evening. Ed. "For words?" "For stupidity loud enough to poison supper." Caleb heard by evening. He called Mara to the office and said, "You should not have had to defend yourself." She braced for dismissal anyway. "But I did." "Yes." He leaned against the desk. "Do you want to leave?" The question struck harder than an order would have. For a moment she saw the shape of escape. Cinder Wash, the cabin, Silas. A life that had been waiting to swallow her again. "No," she said. Caleb studied her. "Because of the contract?" "Because I am good at this." The room held that truth carefully. He nodded once. "Yes, you are." No compliment had ever made her feel so seen or so endangered. 2 days later, Silas arrived in Old Penn's wagon. He stood in the yard, twisting his hat, thinner than before, but clear-eyed. "The bank is paid," he said. Mara could not speak. "Every cent you sent. Mrs. Bell helped me take it straight there. I have been hauling stone and fixing roofs. I have not had a drink in 6 weeks." She wanted to run to him. She wanted to hit him. She did neither. "The house is safe?" she asked. "It is." His mouth trembled. "You saved it." Relief came, but it did not come alone. Behind it was something Mara had not expected. Refusal. "Come home," Silas said. "You do not have to stay here now." Mara looked toward the kitchen window. Inside, dough rose under a cloth. June's crooked handwriting labeled a jar of cinnamon. The men's plates were stacked neatly by the wash basin, because they had finally learned to do it. Her hands were cracked. Her back ached. She had never been more tired. She had also never been more herself. "I am finishing the contract." Silas blinked. "Why?" "Because the debt was yours and mine, but this life is mine." He looked at her like he had lost a sister and found a stranger. Maybe he had. The trouble did not fade. Horace Price made certain of that. Supplies began arriving late. Flour sacks came light. Kerosene was suddenly unavailable unless Caleb agreed to discuss the situation like a reasonable man. Price Mercantile had the only reliable freight connection in the valley, and Horace Price knew exactly how to squeeze a ranch without touching a gun. Caleb rode to town twice and returned both times with his jaw locked. Mara stretched meals until there was no stretch left. She made beans taste different with smoke and onion. She turned sour milk into biscuits. She cut bruises from fruit and used what remained. She boiled bones until they gave up everything they had. Then came the November afternoon when raised voices rolled across the yard while June stood at Mara's table cutting molasses dough into stars. Mara looked through the window. 6 riders had stopped outside the main house. Horace Price sat at the center of them in a black coat too fine for dust. Beside him, Cade Larkin grinned from the saddle. Cade was not a Price by blood, but he had the useful loyalty of a man who could be bought with cash and permission to be cruel. "Go to Elena," Mara told June. June did not argue. That frightened Mara more than if she had. By the time Mara stepped outside, Wyatt was already between the riders and the porch. Horace Price's voice carried. "This ranch has become a disgrace to the valley." Caleb stood at the top of the steps, one hand on the porch rail. "Then do not visit." Price's face darkened. "This is amusing. My daughter's name has been dragged through dust because you chose to shelter a scheming kitchen girl." Mara moved into the open. "I am not sheltered," she said. "I am employed." Cade laughed. "Listen to that. The cook thinks wages make her a lady." Mara turned her head slowly. "No, work makes me a worker. Decency would make you a man, but here we are." Someone behind her choked. Cade swung down from the saddle. Caleb stepped off the porch, but Mara lifted one hand without looking at him. Cade came close enough for her to smell tobacco on his coat. "You have caused a lot of trouble," he said. "Supper. You have made yourself familiar where you do not belong. I belong wherever my labor is honest." He reached for her wrist. The yard changed in a breath. Boots scraped. A horse tossed its head. Wyatt's hand dropped toward his holster. Cade's fingers closed around Mara's arm. Mara did not think. She struck him. The slap snapped his face sideways and knocked the grin clean off it. For one impossible second, no one moved. Cade looked back at her with murder in his eyes. Mara's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her teeth, but her voice came clear. "Touch me again, and I will use the cast-iron skillet next." Caleb stopped 2 steps away. He did not rescue her. He did not silence her. He stood close enough to make clear she was not alone, and far enough to let the moment remain hers. Horace Price recovered first. "There," he said, pointing at Mara. "There's your proof. A violent woman with no breeding, no restraint, and no place among decent people." "Decent people do not ride armed onto a man's land to threaten his cook," Caleb said. Price smiled thinly. "Then let the valley decide what she is. The Founders' Fair is in 3 weeks. Public cook trial. Ranch wife, boarding house woman, and hotel cook in the county will be there. If Miss Whitcomb is so respectable, let her prove it where everyone can see." Mara felt the trap open. If she refused, the gossip became truth. If she accepted, she would be judged by women who had already condemned her, and men who wanted her humiliated. Caleb said, "She owes you nothing." Mara looked at Cade's red cheek, then at June's pale face in the house window, then at the men who had eaten from her hands, and needed to see whether work could stand up to money. "I will enter." Caleb turned. "Mara," she kept her eyes on Price. "You and your daughter apologize in public, not to Mr. Rourke, to me, to Mrs. Marquez, and to June for making her home ugly." Price laughed. "When you win?" "When?" That night, fear found her. It waited until the ranch went quiet, and then sat beside her bed like an old creditor. She could cook for tired men. She could make food from scraps. She could stretch flour and mend a menu. But a fair was different. A fair had judges, ladies with family recipes, hotel cooks with polished copper pans. Adeline Price in a new dress, watching every shake of Mara's hands. Elena found her in the kitchen after midnight, staring at a bowl of flour. "Bread will not rise faster because you threaten it," Elena said. Mara exhaled. "I do not know how to beat them." "Then stop trying to beat them at their own table." Elena opened a small wooden box she kept locked in the pantry. Inside were folded papers, spice packets, and a brass measuring spoon worn smooth by years of use. "My mother made food for men who thought our names were too hard to say," Elena said. "She learned what they expected, then gave them something better without asking permission." Mara touched one paper but did not lift it. "I cannot take your family recipes." "You are not taking, you are learning. There is a difference." For 3 weeks, Iron Gate became a school. Elena taught Mara how cinnamon could deepen apples without making them loud, how a pinch of dried chile could make sweetness wake up, how steam under a covered pan could soften tough meat when a proper oven failed. June became the official taster and the most merciless judge. "Too much molasses," she said one afternoon. Mara made a note. "The crust is right," June added. "It breaks like snow." Wyatt built a practice fire pit behind the kitchen. Amos brought clean river stones for heat. Benton volunteered to peel apples and cut his thumb within 2 minutes, after which he was demoted to cheering. Caleb came late some nights, under the pretense of checking supply counts. He found Mara rolling dough by lamplight, her hair coming loose, flour on her cheek. "You are working yourself hollow," he said. "I've been hollow before. This is better." He leaned against the doorway. What did Price really threaten in town? Mara did not answer. Caleb's voice lowered. "Mara." She set down the rolling pin. "He told the freight men Iron Gate's credit was unstable. He told the church committee I was not fit to stand beside respectable women. He told Mrs. Bell that Silas's sobriety would not last, because weak blood runs true." Caleb's face went cold. "I can handle what he says about me," Mara said. "He's reaching for everyone around me. That is how men like Price fight. They do not strike the person in front of them if they can starve the room behind her." "Then I will feed the room." The words came out before she had shaped them. Caleb looked at her as if she had just named something he had known, but never heard spoken. On the morning of the Founders' Fair, the whole ranch smelled like nerves. Mara packed her pans, her knives, Elena's brass spoon, her mother's recipe book, and 3 aprons. June tucked a folded paper into the basket. "Philuk," she whispered. Mara opened it later in the wagon. It was a drawing of a loaf of bread with a crown on it. In Cinderwash, the fairgrounds stood behind the church, marked by bunting, sawdust paths, and rows of tables under canvas shade. The cook trial occupied the largest tent. Everyone wanted to see whether the ranch cook would disgrace herself. Adeline Price stood near the judges in a lavender dress, smiling as if the day already belonged to her. Horace Price nodded to Mara. "Good of you to show." Mara smiled back. "I said I would." The first wrong thing happened before the bell. Her flour sack had been cut and re-sewn. She noticed because Elena had taught her that honest stitching did not hide itself. Inside, the flour smelled faintly bitter. The second wrong thing was the lard. Rancid. The third was the oven assigned to her station. Its lower hinge had been loosened, which meant the heat would bleed unevenly and scorch anything delicate. Mara stood very still. Adeline watched from across the tent. June whispered, "What do we do?" Mara wanted to cry. Instead, she remembered the filthy bunkhouse kitchen. 1 onion, half a scoop of meal, men waiting at dawn. Elena's voice, "Shame never fed a man." She looked at the fair rules. Contestants could use any ingredient present in the public pantry. They could cook on any approved heat source. Nothing said the food had to be fancy. "Wyatt," she said. He leaned in. "Tell me." "I need clean cornmeal from the chuck display, apples from the children's game, fresh butter from Mrs. Bell's boarding house basket, and the iron skillet from our wagon." Wyatt smiled slowly. "That all?" "No, I need everyone to stop looking scared." Within minutes, Iron Gate moved like a crew under storm orders. Elena argued with a churchwoman until the woman surrendered clean milk. Amos found a crate of apples and paid twice what they were worth. Benton guarded the station like a saint with a black eye. Caleb stood at the tent edge, not interfering, just present. Mara abandoned the oven, built her meal over iron and coals. Skillet chicken sealed in butter and herbs. Corn cakes with crisp edges and soft centers. Apple chili hand pies fried in shallow fat, dusted with cinnamon sugar so fine it looked like red gold sand. It was not the meal she had planned. It was the meal she knew how to make when the world tried to take away comfort and leave only heat. The judges tasted in silence. Mrs. Kettering, who had run the church kitchen since before Mara was born, took 1 bite of the hand pie and looked up sharply. "What is in this?" Mara's mouth went dry. "Apples, cinnamon, a little chili, butter crust." "Chili?" Adeline said, too loudly. "In dessert?" Mrs. Kettering took another bite. "Yes." The other judges followed. The tent grew quiet enough for Mara to hear oil snapping in the pan. Horace Price shifted near the entrance. Then old Penn, who had been watching from the side, picked up the cut flour sack from Mara's station. "Funny thing," he said. "This here sack carries Price mercantile twine. Same knot they use on feed orders." Adeline's smile faltered. Wyatt stepped forward with the rancid lard crock. This, too, marked from Price Storage. Horace barked. That proves nothing. No, Mrs. Bell said from the back, but it explains plenty. The judges withdrew. The crowd became a living thing, murmuring, turning, measuring the story all over again. For months, they had thought they were watching a poor woman reach above herself. Now they saw a rich family afraid of her biscuits. When the blue ribbon was placed beside Mara's skillet, nobody spoke for half a second. Then Irongate erupted. June screamed as if the world had been saved. Elena covered her mouth with both hands. Silas, who had come quietly and stood at the back, took off his hat and cried where anyone could see him. Mara looked at the ribbon, then at the crowd, then at Horace Price. The apology came stiff and bitter. Adeline's was worse. I spoke unkindly and without truth. Apologize. Mara could have made it ugly. She could have listed every whisper, every look, every delayed sack of flour and poisoned kindness. Instead, she said, accepted. Not because they deserved peace, because she did. The weeks after the fair did not turn her life into a song. Price Mercantile lost business, but Horace did not become humble. Adeline stopped smiling at Mara, which was improvement enough. Some women in town nodded now. Others looked away. Respect came slowly, because shame often has to walk home first. Silas stayed sober. He fixed the cabin roof, leased half the land to a neighbor for grazing, and wrote letters in a careful hand. The first one said only, I am trying. Mara kept it folded in her recipe book. At Irongate, the men stopped treating Mara's kitchen as a place they visited, and began treating it as the center of the ranch. They brought news there first. They washed their hands before entering, because Elena had threatened a wooden spoon, and Mara had not stopped her. June's lessons continued, and the girl no longer asked whether people left. She asked what they would make next. On the last evening of Mara's 6-month agreement, Caleb found her in the kitchen after supper. The bread dough sat covered near the stove, rising slow and steady in the warm dark. He held an envelope. Final wages, he said. Mara took it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb said, I would like you to stay. As cook? As whatever you choose first. Cook, house manager, partner in the new boarding kitchen we discussed, tyrant of biscuits. I am open to negotiation. Mara laughed softly. That is a poor business offer. It is not only business. The kitchen felt suddenly smaller. Caleb removed his hat, though he was indoors and had no reason to be wearing it, except that nervous men do strange things with their hands. I will not pretend gossip is gone, he said. I will not pretend life here is easy. I have a daughter who loves you, a ranch that needs you, and a heart I thought had been buried with my wife until you walked into that ruined kitchen and started ordering sinners to scrub pans. Mara looked down. Her hands were rough, scarred. Flour caught beneath one nail. They were not the hands of a lady in a lavender dress. They were the hands that had saved a house, fed a ranch, slapped a bully, and made sweetness out of heat. What if I stay because I want all of it? She asked. The kitchen, the work, June, you, my own name, still mine. Caleb's answer came without hesitation. Then we build around that. June appeared in the doorway because children always knew when life was changing and never respected closed doors. "Are you staying?" she asked. Mara looked at Caleb, then at the dough beside the stove. Bread did not rise because the world was gentle. It rose because someone gave it warmth, covered it against the cold, and trusted it through the waiting. "Yes," Mara said, "I am staying." June ran into her arms. Outside, the wind moved over the corrals, carrying dust, cattle, and the last talk of a town that had mistaken softness for weakness. The town had tried to keep Mara Whitcomb small. The fire did the opposite. It made her rise.